Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, today we're going to be going through content analysis. Content analysis is really key when we're looking at fixed media. It's kind of the first thing to note here. So, you may be doing an analysis surrounding how African Americans are depicted in Modern Family, or you may be interested in how the female life or aspect of living female is depicted on The Office, or how is race and ethnicity covered on Blackish, right? So we can look at issues behind race depiction, gender depiction, a whole host of different things that we may be interested in looking at through the lens of looking at fixed media, reading through scripts, or it could be watching an entire season of something. Or it could be looking at scripts and looking for certain language that's used, kind of delving into what kind of themes may actually be exuded by some of the content that you and I watch. And so content analysis is really useful in unearthing things that aren't really obvious to us, right? The Office makes a lot of references to gender, race, and ethnicities and a whole host of other things, but the levels in which it does so and the kind of language that's used probably is less apparent to us because, after all, we may watch an episode here or there and we're not really analyzing every piece of language that's used. Or symbolism, right? Could be images, could be metaphors, could be other things that are used in these kinds of shows. Additionally, you can do a content analysis with rap music or rock and roll music or reggae music, and you might be looking at themes of sex, drugs, violence, domestic abuse as well, right? And so there are many different themes and ideas and results and insights that you can pull out from analyzing fixed kinds of media. And so content analysis is very useful in looking at a whole host of different media out there. So let's get started. And so what is this? Well, why is content analysis so crucial to mass communication research? So it is, as I alluded to earlier, a systematic look at texts, images, and symbolic matter. In the 1920s, major increase in newspaper and magazine reading led to scholars analyzing what was being printed in magazines and in newspapers. So journalism schools blossom and lead for interest surrounding what types of mass communication were being disseminated to audiences. So it looked at texts, and this was very instrumental in really looking at how propaganda influenced us, right? Especially during World War II, most American citizens were exposed to American propaganda and even German propaganda and all sorts of propaganda that were produced during World War II. And so it was very key to have a system in which we were able to analyze and figure out what was being said and how it was being said to audiences. And this was relatively new, as content analyses has only taken off since the 50s and 60s. So this is still somewhat of a new method for researchers. Let's keep going. Okay, so why is this important? People are always going to read texts differently. This is really crucial to understand here. If Cynthia and Jake are reading the same article about perhaps China and US trade wars, if you will, which is currently brewing as of this lecture, people interpret texts differently all the time. Frankly, think about the last time you received a text from a loved one. Have we been bent out of shape or pissed or angry because we misunderstood some sort of text that was sent to us? Maybe by a friend, maybe by a boyfriend or girlfriend. We've all been there. And so this is emblematic and indicative of how people construe texts. The problem is, even though we're all human, we read things differently. The messages that are disseminated from anything, be it a newspaper or a magazine, likely vary across readers. The objectives of industry and mass communication also may be latent in nature. This is really the crux at which content analysis is really used by scholars. It really is to unearth and illuminate what's going on in industry and what's going on in media. And so agenda setting looks at different kinds of agendas that might be set by the media industry, by a particular industry for that matter. Maybe the media industry wants us to think of Bernie Sanders in a particular light, or perhaps Donald Trump in a particular light. And so agenda setting means that there's this kind of hidden agenda that might be brewing. And so content analysis allows us the opportunity to really dive deep and to get a sense of what patterns of language and images are being produced by media and how they may be swaying us. Now, McCombs first picked up on this in 1972, illustrating that what news covered as important was correlated to that of what the undecided voters thought was important during the 1968 presidential election. So we may all think that we have our own individual agency over what we think and how we think, and that there's nothing that influences us. Unfortunately, we are very much influenced by messages surrounding us, be it from the news, be it from media organizations. It is absolutely crucial that we are cognizant of this when we're studying texts. How a sender sends out communication and its intent may not be related to how an audience member interprets things. This is critical to note as you're thinking about how people construe and look at different kinds of texts. Let's move along. So why do we do this? We do it for patterns. We look for systematic patterns across content. We run statistical analyses like chi-squares and t-tests to determine statistical significance across categories as well as relationships with other variables, such as correlations and regressions. Now, I'm not going to sit here and describe statistical analyses like this. You can take another class with me. But know that we're trying to find patterns that have statistical significant value. Let's move along. Where can we analyze content? We can do this across a wide variety of different mediums. Like I said earlier, we can look at TV shows, we can look at songs, we can look at texts, we can look at social media, interviews, and really any kind of fixed media that's available. You can look at Twitter posts because they're fixed. You can look at songs, they're fixed. You can look at interviews, they're fixed. You can look at TV scripts or shows or movies. You can look at all of these different elements and measure themes, measure for themes, measure for patterns, measure for how romance might be exhibited in horror movies from 1960 to 1980, or how female athletes are depicted on Sports Illustrated covers from 1985 to 2000, right? If you can make a case for studying this stuff during the amount of time that you've given yourself, you have a study, you have a bona fide study that might be useful and might bring insights into how women are depicted or how romance is depicted or how violence may be depicted in media. Let's move along. So what do we look for? Well, really anything. We look at a whole host of things here. As I said earlier, we can look at gender, we can look at race, we can look at emotions, we can look at how comedy is depicted in British television versus US television. We can look at what's funny for one country versus what's funny for another one. We can look at genres. We can look at how the horror genre is used in Japan versus the United States. And many people will say that Japanese horror is in fact more scary or scarier than US horror for that matter. And so those are things that you can compare and contrast. Themes like sex, deceit, anger, and violence, and consumer engagement, even intent to purchase, can be measured, right? If we look at tweet posts from before the latest Gatorade flavor was introduced to after the Gatorade flavor was introduced, we can compare and contrast how tweets were constructed and posted before the new flavor and after the new flavor as well. Let's move along. Unit of analysis. This is important to note here. What is our unit of analysis? So a few things here that you should be mindful of. For one, the sampling unit. That's critical to note here. Units that are distinguished for selective inclusion in analysis. There might be a certain number of issues in a newspaper. So your sampling unit might be all rap albums from 1990 to 1995. Maybe that might be something that you're interested in looking at. And so it's important to define your sampling unit to what you want to look at. Is it 100 newspapers from the New York Times in the last year? Are you going to randomly select newspapers to look through? Are you going to look at all ESPN, the magazines from 2000 to 2010? You're going to randomly select them. How would you construct that? Why would you do a random sample? Is it necessary, or is it better to look at each magazine? You'll notice in a lot of content analyses, authors tend to look at everything. For instance, if you're going to look at magazines from ESPN the magazine from 2012 to 2018, you're going to read each one of them. That is the very, very typical objective of a lot of content analyses scholars. And it's really because to ensure thoroughness, right? To really ensure that you've looked at every piece of relevant evidence toward what you're trying to get a sense of. Recording coding unit, these are units that are distinguished for separate description, transcription, recording, or coding. And then recording or coding. You may rely on recorded or coded content. Do we record and cut content ourselves before analysis? So this is key. If I'm in New York City and what I'd like to do is a content analysis on what people do in a park, well, it's not as though there are a lot of photos sitting around of people doing things in the park. Certainly, I could go on Instagram and find some stuff. Certainly, I could try to do other kinds of social media work to figure out what people may have posted about, people in parks. But I could also go to Central Park and I could just kind of take photos around because it's a public place, and then I can analyze them myself, right? If I needed to record that, if I needed to do that, I could create my own evidence. That's something to be mindful of depending upon what you're trying to view here in your own content analysis. Let's move along. So during content analysis, it's possible that content may be indicative of content. Rap lyrics that denigrate women or are socially conscious. And so it's possible that content may be indicative of content. That's important to note here. So you want to know that what kinds of evidence that you have, how indicative they are of the content itself. Content may be a property of the source or text. So you may also have to think about the amount of awkward moments shown in The Office and how you might want to piece that out. Is it necessary that it's always Jim looking in the camera? Or what about Michael? Content may emerge in the process of a research analysis. So, as I said earlier, taking photos in a park or recording speeches made by classmates. These are all different ways in which you can collect information that can help you during your content analysis. Let's move along. But people think differently. They certainly do. And I said that in the beginning here. We need coder training. Of course, people do think differently. In content analysis, we need to make sure that two coders can agree on the results of the study. In any academic content analysis study that's published, there are usually at least two coders. This is really, really important because you want to be sure that you and your fellow coder know what's going on. It may very well be that if I'm doing a content analysis with Michael, him and I may have only watched certain horror movies. And so he may watch Japanese horror. I only watch US horror. And frankly, I don't watch that much horror anyway. And if that's the case, then we both come into this with two different contexts for how we perceive violence, how we perceive blood, how we perceive death, and all other things that are associated and really are hallmarks of the horror movie industry. And so if we're doing a study to kind of look at and maybe compare and contrast how horror is determined or perceived or executed in Japan versus the US, it may very well mean that we kind of have to have a conversation and figure out what means what. Remember, in content analysis, we are counting and numerically determining what's going on in a particular piece of text. And so we have to be on the same page about, well, what constitutes violence? Is it stabbing? Is it somebody dying? Do you have to die? Do you not have to die for violence? Is violence shouting? Is it screaming and yelling? Is it calling somebody a terrible word? Is it verbal abuse? Does verbal abuse fall under violence? Or does it not? These are the kinds of conversations you have to have with your researcher, your fellow researcher or researchers. It is recommended not to go past 3, though, with content analysis, because remember, for every additional person you have in, everybody has to be sure that they're on the same page. Otherwise, the content analysis may have issues. Let's go back to the slide. And so researchers must have a conversation about the variables, how you're going to operationalize those variables, and the measurements and recording instruments you're going to use here. Let's move along. Okay, but how do we know we've actually agreed? Intercoder reliability. Now, again, before anybody runs out of this lecture, I am by no means going to go through how to run the statistical analyses themselves. Again, I offer other classes that delve into that. But intercoder reliability is still something that's important to know. And if any of you wind up reading a content analysis study, you should know how strong the intercoder reliability is. And so it's a statistical check that ensures that comparisons that are made across each variable in the content analysis are real and are strong. So this is known as Krippendorff's alpha. The score should be above 0.70, but 0.60 is okay. It is necessary really to have it above 0.70. It ensures a stronger study. It ensures that what you're reading is robust, and it helps ensure that there's agreement between the two researchers. Coder answers are compared with one another through this statistic. The goal is to have two coders corroborate what is going on in the unit of analysis. So what you're looking at, it could be text, books, newspapers, photos, songs, and video, among other elements here. Let's move along. So 2 academic content analyses. I'm going to be going through 2 studies here just to give you a sense of what content analysis might look like in an academic context. Let's move along. So gender roles in tween television programming, a content analysis of 2 genres. So the study itself looked at genre portrayals in 49 episodes of 40 distinct US tween television programs. The Disney Channel, Disney XD, Nickelodeon, and the Turner Cartoon Network. Results found that females were underrepresented in action and adventure, but gender distribution was representative of US population. Females were more attractive and interested in appearance than males. Males varied more in attractiveness and were stereotypically depicted in action and adventure television shows. Let's move along. The unit of analysis here, just to kind of give you a sense of how the study was structured, they looked at the program and they looked at the character. Each television program filled a 30-minute time slot. Programs could be 1 21 or 22-minute episode, or 2 11 to 12-minute episodes. All were complete stories, and they looked at 204 characters. Again, this gets into our previous discussion surrounding how to carefully look at content as you're moving along in your study. And here, everything was specified. And it's really clear how they analyzed what they analyzed here. Let's move along. And so these were the hypotheses that were offered in this study. There are more male than female characters overall, and in each genre. Male characters are overrepresented in relation to the US population in action-adventure programs. Male and female characters are represented according to the male-female distribution in the US population in teen scene programs. As you can see right here, 3 different relationships are described here. And remember, hypotheses allow us to test relationships. And it also keeps us honest and focused as researchers. Let's move along. Example of the questionnaire itself, you can see here that alpha scores are readily made available here. So on the left-hand side, you can certainly see variables that are measured here: gender, race, social age, so on and so forth. That column, the alpha, is important here to help us understand Krippendorf's alpha scores here. You can see which ones are 0.70. You can see which ones are stronger than others. Gender and race should be strong. Those are fairly easy to determine. And so social age as well. But you can see attractiveness is a little bit difficult to get agreement on across researchers here. And remember, we're going by our opinions, and we're going by what we perceive to be true. So this is one of the issues, if you will, or kind of challenges that content analysis scholars face all the time. Let's move along. So race and ethnic relations are a form of social interaction. And this is based around this study entitled Representations of Interpersonal Interaction in Race and Ethnicity, an examination of primetime network television programs. So the idea is that race and ethnic relations are a form of social interaction. And this study looked at primetime television programs on 4 major U.S. broadcast networks. Racial ethnic identity, or REI, is studied here. How interpersonal interactions between people is depicted, how races and ethnicities interaction on television is depicted. Let's move along. So we have a lot of RQs here, a lot of research questions here. I won't read all of them, but I will read a few of them. Which groups are most often portrayed interacting with which other groups? What relationship types, i.e. social scenarios, are most common when different REIs, interaction combinations, are present? So this is really looking at how different races and ethnicities are portrayed, and especially when they're interacting with each other. So that's kind of the crux, the linchpin of this particular study. Let's move along. And so as you can see here, they listed the number of interactions and percentage of appearances in overall sample here across white, black, Latino, Asian American or Asian, and Middle Eastern. And you can see moving down, you can see the different kinds of interactions that they measured for as well here. Let's move along. Again, you can see here the deviation of different racial ethnic groups and group combinations from chance expectations by relationship type. So this is really looking at when these races and ethnicities interact, what is the context? You can see the different kinds of interactions on the left, and you can see the contexts out on the right. So up top in that first row, you can see romance, family, work-related, crime-related, friendship, and strangers, right? All the kinds of interactions we have as people, but kind of sifted through based on race and ethnicity. Let's move along. For here, you can see the deviations based on channels. So now we're looking at the different kinds of race and ethnic interactions, if you will, across CBS, ABC, NBC, and Fox. So really seeing which networks might be more interested in certain kinds of depictions or certain kinds of discussions or certain kinds of interactions between different kinds of races on television. And for instance, you can see group members in interactions. You can see Latinos are exhibited quite more on CBS, which is 47, than Fox, which is 19. Let's move along. And for deviation of different race ethnicity groups and group combinations from chance expectations by genre, we also have on the left, once again, the different race ethnicity interactions, and we have it cut up by genre, by drama, by thriller, by mystery, and by sitcom and animation and police procedural. And so you can see here for sure that in drama, all white interactions are very, very common at 141. You can also see that white and black interactions are exceptionally low in animation. That's 29. And so this is another useful chart, kind of cutting up our own interactions based on genres. Let's move along. Some assumptions of content analysis. We assume that texts may have an objective, but they may not, right? We don't know if Sports Illustrated meant to be a feminist magazine or if it meant not to be a feminist magazine, right? We're only looking at the evidence. And if there is a pattern, well, it might be because that's just maybe how people think, or maybe what sells more. It may not be the case that there is an agenda, right? It's kind of difficult to note that. We don't know what the goal of the source usually is unless it's explicitly stated. Texts do not have a single meaning that can be found. There are numerous perspectives, and meanings speak to something other. And so meanings speak always to one more kind of perspective, always to something else. That's important to be mindful of here as we're making conclusions and as we're drawing results from our own content analyses. Let's move along. Is this connected to industry? Yes. Thematic analyses may be used in industry. One study considered how public broadcasting service, public relations jobs impacted its coverage in newspapers. And so it's important to be able to do these kinds of things here. And so there are myriad Twitter studies that look at Twitter posts on marijuana, TV promotion, and advertising. So yes, you can certainly do content analysis on a whole slew of things that are very much industry focused. So as you can see here, there's a lot that goes into content analysis. There are a lot of opportunities for us to also learn how the world communicates with us and how the world sends messages and different kinds of information to us. It's important to know how females are depicted in advertisements, or maybe how romance is depicted in action movies versus horror movies. It's the same kind of love, it's the same kind of feel, but in genres, love might mean something different. There are a lot of different things that we can unearth when we closely examine language, especially texts, songs, scripts, and even images for that matter. Well, that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.